So with that out of the way, let us move on then, and let me introduce you to our great lineup for today. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so we have two panelists lined up, and I should mention that unfortunately one of them is we had a little audio problem in locking in today and flying a little bit blind, but I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue here. Our first panelist is Arun Belegri, and I'm sure I'm messing that up, but Arun is Program Director, Application and Infrastructure Management at IBM. And then joining Arun is Dan Kern, and Dan is a solution architect with Prolifics, an IBM partner, and Dan will, well, he can probably tell you a little bit more about Prolifics when he jumps on. Dan and Arun, just to do a quick sound check. Dan, do you hear me?
Absolutely, yes, Alan.
Fantastic. And Arun, I know you had a little bit of some challenges getting on today, but you there?
I am here. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, sound great. Okay, with that being said, as I mentioned with Arun's little difficulties, he's flying a little bit blind, so if we'll try to play guide dog here for him a bit. Anyway, with that being said, let me turn this over to our panelist, and we will be in touch. Gentlemen, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Appreciate it. And thank you all for attending this session with DevOps.com. As Alan mentioned, my name is Arun Belegiri, and Alan got the pronunciation right, so we'll hold him to it. So essentially, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through what APM is, and for folks that are not familiar with the acronym, we come from the tech industry, love acronyms, but let me kind of expand a little bit. APM stands for Application Performance Management, and we'll go through a little bit of, if you're not familiar with it, that's fine. We'll go through a little bit of what that is and why that matters. And then, Dan, maybe if you want to take a minute, talk about yourself, and then we'll get started.
Absolutely. Thanks, Arun. I've had the pleasure of working with IBM Technologies since about the year 2000, and I've known Arun for almost 10 years now. He actually helped introduce me into the APM space. And over the years, in my various roles with Prolifics, an IBM Premier Business Partner, I've been able to get my hands into the administration, architecture, performance tuning, and troubleshooting of many different middleware components, everything from web servers, application servers, messaging, services, appliances. So my company brings a lot of experience in that realm, and I'm hoping that some of the stories that I can share from my experiences will also help everybody on the call.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. So guys, if we can go to the next slide, please. Let me kind of get started here. We kind of think about, the concept of applications. We think about it as application performance management, but really at the end of the day, applications are what run businesses. Today, you're looking at a fundamental change happening in the industry that's making applications part and parcel of driving what I would call the digital enablement of the enterprise or the organization. And so you're seeing a big focus on applications and the management of applications per se. Now, the key here is that application management has a business impact, and really at the end of the day, part of why APM has become more and more important, getting to be more important, is really because of the fact that it enables to keep that business results engine going as such. So if you go to the next slide very quickly. So we talk about applications and digital enablement, and ultimately in the context of what we call the new application economy. What this really means at the end of the day is we're looking at an explosion of apps. You got mobile apps. Everybody's got 200, but probably 20, 200 apps on their phone. Well, we all collaborate on a regular basis. We're all on Facebook, LinkedIn, pick your collaboration exercise. We are exchanging information in such large quantities that we've basically made everything pretty much a big data problem per se. we are shifting fundamentally our workloads. We're going away from the traditional on-prem into potentially private clouds, into public clouds. And then not only that, we are also significantly expanding the number of devices that connect up to the network with the concept around the Internet of Things. So this is really kind of driving what I would call the new application economy, and data is part and parcel of that application economy. And at a fundamental level, is the ability to collect that data, to actually analyze that data, and to be able to visualize the data is really what you would think of it at the end of the day in the context of the applications environment is what APM is all about. So what you'll find is ultimately customers that are going to be part and parcel of this economy. You're going to see lines of business in enterprises, part and parcel of the economy. And in the net, what you're also seeing is ultimately relating to the concept of what I would call the DevOps community, which is driven by what we call the Blooming's Garage method, which is really the concept of being able to take an application through its full life cycle. So you're going to see all of that sort of part and parcel of driving in this new context of the application economy. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, you know, the key here is as you begin to think about what's happened, you're really looking at apps effectively changing in industry. We're causing the apps are becoming disruptors in the industry. Call it the Uber syndrome for most part, where there's a company with an app that fundamentally redefines an industry altogether. So you're beginning to see sort of applications being sort of the lifeblood of the industry itself, and this is going to be a trend that's going to roll on for quite some time. And so what we need to do is to basically ensure that those apps are going to be running 24/7, and that's really the foundation as we begin to think about what we do in the APM space. What I wanted to do next is maybe run a quick poll for the folks who are attending to get a sense of where you guys are at in terms of your your roles, to give us a little bit of a context of how this session could be tweaked. Alan, I'll let you run it.
Sorry. Okay, so guys, we've got a survey question up here, a real simple one. What best describes your role in the organization? And we ask you to select one of the following: development, testing, operations, application owner. Maybe, well, we didn't add it in there, but none of the above. Anyway, hopefully the overwhelming majority of you fit into one of these 4 buckets, and we'll give you just another 5 seconds or so to answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and survey says, so, well, pretty much what I guess we'd expect on a DevOps related webinar. 37% of you are in development and 37% of you are in operations, 9% in testing, and 16% are application owners.
Fantastic.
Arun, Dan, what do you think?
Yeah. It's great. This is typically what I would expect to see. So what is interesting in this survey is you're finding sort of this overall, sort of all these areas kind of converging under the umbrella of what I would call DevOps. And I look at DevOps as sort of that new enabler as such. Essentially the traditional model of ops and dev, or there was a big wall in between, you threw things over the wall, you kind of dealt with it in different departments. Now we're beginning to see the convergence of it. And that is fantastic to see sort of a wide audience here. So one thing I wanted to do in the next couple of slides or so is really kind of give you a sense of what APM is for folks that have never heard of this before, because typically when you thought about APM, you thought of it as a production tool. It was really something that the guys on the production side of the house took care of. And what we wanted to do is we're really talking about bringing those value props ultimately from the production side of the house into the dev test side of the house. So we began to sort of look at all folks looking at one class of tools rather than multiple different classes of tools. So let me spend a couple of minutes kind of giving you guys a sense of what is, at a very simple level, what is APM about. So one of the biggest challenges we're beginning to see as we talk about the digital economy is the idea that we're looking at a highly heterogeneous environment. You're getting cloud workloads, you're getting on-prem workloads, they're all interacting with each other, and then we're having people interact on multiple types of devices, and we're having people interact with it on a global basis. So what you've done is you've essentially, there's a very complex ecosystem around these applications, and what APM has traditionally done is focus on delivering a value proposition to that audience to ensure that that application is available at all times. So we're talking about that 99.999% availability aspect. And when people ask me the very simple question is, what is APM? I just tell them it's sort of a three-step process as I look at what APM is. I look at APM as the context of being able to identify a problem, because the challenge you get sometimes is you don't really want to know if a problem has already occurred. You really would like to know a sense of, is there a problem coming up? And then so you can actually deal with it to resolve it before the problem has already occurred. So in a sense, you want to really be able to identify the problem and identify the problem very early in the cycle. Not only in the context of being able to predict a problem in a production setting, you want to be able to identify potential production problems, or you want to identify that in your test environments. You want to identify it in your dev environment. So you don't really want to send it off to production to experience the problem there. You want to avoid the problem altogether by dev testing it all the way through. So that's part of moving it left and shifting left as I think about it, starting on the production side, but moving all the way down to the dev side of the house to really kind of drive the ability to solve these problems instantly. The next thing you want to do is you want to isolate the problem. You have complex applications. One of the things you'll see in subsequent slides, we talk about it, your dev test environments are going to get more complex in the era of cloud. They're going to be more representative of what production is all about. So you really want to be isolating these problems effectively in the environment. So you don't want to be out there searching and hunting and reading every log and trying to figure this out. It's going to take too long. So what we really want to do is you want to isolate it. You isolate it very, very quickly. And then the third aspect of what you would typically do is, a lot of developers would know, and a lot of even production folks would know, is really you want to diagnose the problem. You want to actually potentially get to line of code to know what the problem really is. So this is really a sense of what APM is, and this is part of the reason why we think about APM in the context of running early in the cycle to get these problems out early in the cycle, shifting left effectively to get that done. So what I wanted to do is just maybe go back to a very quick poll. If, based on this description, how many of you guys have knowledge of APM? So I can get a sense of whether I need to go into a little bit of detail or not. If you want to run polling questions too, that would be great.
Yes, we have them. And Arun, just a quick message. Occasionally you're dropping a little on the audio. It's not too bad, but I want you to just be aware of it. So our second polling question is up, and it is, what is your level, in your opinion anyway, what is your level of knowledge of application performance management? Would you rate yourself an expert, moderately knowledgeable, or really a novice in the area? And most of you have already voted. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and our answers are, wow, I don't know if this is what you were expecting, guys. Only 13% of attendees consider themselves experts. Moderate is 36% of our audience, and over half, 52% of the audience, say they are novices around application performance management, or APM.
Fantastic. As I said, let me then spend a little bit of time kind of talking about what APM is, given that the audience is relatively new to this, and go into a little bit of a breakdown. So if we can get into the next slide, slide 9, that talks about essentially the different capabilities, that would be great. So one of the things you guys begin to think about is, so it looks like most of you have just been introduced to the word of application performance management recently. So the key here is what typically application performance management has done is done multiple levels of things. First, it is focused around what we call end-user monitoring and capabilities around end-user monitoring. The key there is being able to know if a customer is actually having a problem. You really want to know if your problems are through a synthetic user, where a synthetic user is kind of a fake user, but somebody that's testing the system. It's like somebody sitting in the corner there, testing it every so often to make sure everything's working okay. So that's typically who your synthetic user is. And then you've got real users. There's somebody who's logging in, trying to do maybe a trade transaction. You want to be able to know if that particular user is having any particular problem. So you typically have the concept of identifying the problems, but you really want to identify the problems in the terms of the users that are using your application. You may have other ways of looking at all your internal servers, but that's not necessarily as useful as really knowing whether users are experiencing problems per se. And at the very first user that begins to experience problems, you can begin to start looking at what is the cause of the problem to go resolve it. So you begin to think of a capability around what we call end-user monitoring, which is part and parcel of the APM portfolio. Now, a number of folks do this. They do it as performance testing, sometimes out in testing as such. But what APM has truly done with end-user monitoring is really push the envelope of its abilities to not only look at the user's experience, but also what APIs and API experiences are. The other thing that we typically do in an APM context is we look at what we call basic KPI resource monitoring, where we collect key metrics and we propagate status. If you've got a complex application, you want to be able to look at that complex application in the context of one view. This gives you what we call basic resource monitoring. The other thing that we do is what we call topology, where we are able to break down a particular transaction, and we tell you where that transaction is effectively slow. So you could be potentially coming in into a web server. You could then potentially go to maybe an app server somewhere, and maybe the slowness is actually between the app server and the database, or maybe the slowness is between the web server and the app server. So you can kind of break out essentially where your problems on your topology, which results in what you would call tracking your transaction to be able to go figure out exactly where the problem is and how much of those particular transactions are run. And then beyond that, what you're really trying to do is to go into diagnostics. You're really trying to say, hey, I know the problem in my app server here. I really want you to tell me exactly what the problem is in the line of code in that particular app server. Is it a Java application? Is it a Node.js application? You want to be able to drill down into it. And that's kind of what APM tools do, is they kind of take you from very little knowledge of the application to give you a sense of whether the app is doing okay. They give you basic resource monitoring aspects. They give you, topologies of your apps. They also do diagnostics. On top of that, APM has evolved into doing analytics, and really the idea that you want to be able to do things like log analytics. The concept of saying, what's the first thing a lot of developers do? They write error messages into logs. What is the first thing that you want to do when you want to know if something's a problem or not? You want to be able to analyze your logs to figure out what kind of error messages showed up, when did they show up, what is the context of that error message with everything else that you're looking at. And so that's kind of what you do with what we call log analysis. We also do baselining, which essentially gives you what you would call an analytics way of looking at your application in terms of your application performance. And then you can do basic history, trending, things like that. If you had release A and a release B, you wanted to know if the problem was introduced in the release, you could kind of go back and look at the data between A and B, and that's going to very apparently tell you, oh, by the way, the application is slow because when you went from A to B, it slowed down by 20%. So that's really what APM capabilities are, and traditionally these capabilities have been used in production. There's absolutely been sort of the starting point, and then you had a lot of dev tools and everything else in the dev test tools in the dev cycles, but production was usually where APM had its play, but primarily because production environments are complex environments, and production environments have very little tolerance for overhead. So APM tools have kind of mastered the art of doing this with very little overhead and being able to go out and check all the performance basically of your complex application. So that's kind of a very key overview of what kind of components constitute APM. If we want to go to a quick polling question 3, because APM is used in the context of cloud apps, it's used in the context of on-prem apps, or could be used in the context of both. I just want to do a quick gauge of how many folks are really kind of moved on the cloud journey to get a sense of how we want to talk about this in the context of your workloads per se.
Yep, and let me jump in on that one. So this polling question is, what is your current mix of cloud versus hybrid cloud application, or cloud or hybrid cloud application versus traditional on-premise only applications? And this will be interesting. We gave you some ranges here, and everybody may not fit exactly into it. But is 100% of your stuff cloud or hybrid with 0 on-prem? So the first number represents cloud hybrid. The second number represents on-prem. And again, it may not be exact, but it'll give us an idea. If we can close voting off in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and our survey says, well, only 4% are entirely on cloud and hybrid. I thought that number would be higher. 80-20, the usual 80-20 rule applies. 80% cloud hybrid is only 13%. Again, lower than I imagined. 50-50 is also only 8%. I guess here might be the big surprise, guys. 25% cloud hybrid, 75% on-premises represents fully 1/2, 50% of our audience, and then another quarter of our audience, 25%, is 100% on-prem, not cloud hybrid at all. That surprises me. What do you guys? Is that kind of what you expected, fellas?
And actually, that's an interesting point there, Alan, because as people talk about it, and there's so much talk about cloud, you would expect the exact opposite, right? You'd think everybody is in the top A or B option. But what we have, as I've talked to a lot of clients, they're more in the D, E, and E. So in a sense, it's not a surprise as I've talked to clients. But if I read a lot of the documentation in the media and everything else, you would think we're sort of completely different. So that's actually interesting. But and this is actually what it's telling you is sort of a, and maybe Dan can step in as well, sort of his experience. But as we've talked to clients, we look at cloud as sort of people just are, a lot of people are just kind of getting a feel for it. They're just jumping into it now. We all know the Amazon stories. We all know everything else out there. But for most part, what we are finding is that this whole area of cloud has got a huge growth aspect to it, just given that adoption is kind of started, but it's really not reached its peak.
Right, and Arun, to the poll results as well as to your comments on the complexity of the capabilities of APM, we see customers moving through an evolution, shifting from that on-premises, locally hosted model out into the cloud, given any restrictions on their industries, maybe industry oversight, regulatory oversight, data integrity, data security related issues. Now with this, one of the most common questions I get when I talk with my customers and users, development architects, etc., is how does APM differ from the normal development tools that we use, things like JUnit and Selenium for doing testing, the debuggers that the development teams will use from their development environments to connect into an application server or into a middleware environment. Could you take a minute and give us a little insight into that, please?
Yep, that would be great. And so, guys, actually, yeah, that's a good point that you bring up. And so let's go to slide 11. So one of the things that we're finding is as we begin to think about sort of the traditional, what we call cloud-enabled applications. These are what you call traditional on-prem applications that are enabled to be used by cloud apps. But for most part, these have been traditional applications. They go through what you call the dev, test, staging, production lifecycle. That's been the traditional model of how things went out the door. And so what we found here is, as we talked to a lot of clients, that really, you know, in this traditional model of cloud-enabled, we saw a lot of different environments. They'd be a dev environment, a test environment, staging. They're not exactly the same effectively. They're all slightly different. May not be, you know, production is the true representation, but staging is probably as close to production as possible, and test and dev are kind of representations of the environment, not exactly the same. So we found different environments, and then what we found is also exactly to your point, Dan, is the whole concept of the kind of tooling that was used is also very different. Because effectively, as far as they were concerned, their test environment, it would be basic Selenium testing, for example. That could be some very common thing that they did. And this was in the context of driving what I would call the slow IT, the state and steady approach to driving the IT concepts. Because of the fact that we had so many differences and so many things, as every time you switch between any of these environments, you got new things to deal with, and it slowed down the whole IT process somewhat. And that's been traditionally the model that we'll see, and from the poll, it feels like the large part of the personnel out there are using this model per se to kind of drive their traditional application model. But one of the points that we want to make at the end of the day is as we begin to converge into what I would call that DevOps model, the first most important point that I've always articulated is the environments that you're going to be testing in are going to be effectively clones of your production environment. Because every time I've talked to customers, they say, it's great that you gave me something that was tested in your environment, but I want to test it in my environment representative of my production class workload. So effectively what is happening, and you'll see on the right, is in the cloud what we're finding is that you're actually testing in actual customer representative environments. You're not only just running it in production in those kind of environments, you're actually testing it in those environments. You're developing in those environments. Effectively what you're doing is you're cloning your production environment in your cloud. It's much easier to do that in the cloud as anywhere else. And so effectively those complex production environments are being run in your dev test environments as well. Fastest way to find out if you're going to have a problem in a real customer environment as opposed to some kind of fictionalized environment per se. So what you're finding is on the cloud, we're testing in real environments. And more important on that is what you're doing is also not using this. And the example that I use very often is think of it in the context of you have a car coming down the assembly line effectively. What you had was, as it moved down from step to step, you had different tools, you did different things, you moved on to the next step. What you're finding is a very different phenomenon that's happening even in the manufacturing industry is not only are we now we're standardizing, we're essentially putting the car in one place and bringing the tools to it to essentially put it together effectively to get faster with it, to drive what I call fast IT. There isn't the lags associated with that movement across that food chain. And so at a fundamental level, what we're seeing in the cloud happening is there's a limited set of tools, and those tools need to be production class tools because what you're going to be doing is doing production class testing and development all the way through. And this is a key element of why people talk about APM being used in dev test, because APM is traditionally being used in production, has fairly low overhead, it has fairly broad capabilities, and has the ability to deal with complex environments, which are typically representative of your production class environments. And so what you want to be able to do is bring those capabilities left, shift left, all the way to your dev test umbrellas so you can actually now test it all the way through with the same class of tooling. And that helps you sort of gauge if you're making progress as you move down from dev to test to production per se. So that's the concept of what we find with cloud native. It's a different concept of how you're testing it and how you're using your tools ultimately to go forward and take some applications to production. And what that ensures is this context called continuous availability, and you'll see a little bit of it, we'll talk about it, is the idea that you want to ensure that the application is always available at all times. Now the key here is this is what we call fast IT. This is your agile IT. So we want to be able to get you to that agile model where not releasing one every 3 months or 6 months, you're releasing one every week. You're releasing potentially a number of customers out there releasing every day, every minute. So at a fundamental level, what you're doing is you're essentially enabling the ability to release stuff on a very constant basis. So if we go to the next slide, that kind of talks a little bit about some of the stuff here as well in the context of this. So if you look at slide 12, there's the idea of what we call the traditional applications. These were monolithic applications structured very, very differently, right? There you had a lot of common components across. Because of efficiency, you had to do it that way, and then you talk to a common database. and then it kind of scaled out a little bit, but it wasn't what I would call dynamic scale. Then you begin to look at in dev environments what you're seeing more and more of, which is now becoming part of production, the idea that you have microservice-based environments. And these are basically services that are enabled. So effectively, when you're building an app, you're assembling a car. Effectively, you're bringing parts and pieces to it and assembling it rather than making everything by hand effectively. So in a sense, what microservices are is just using clone services across very scalable, dynamic environment. And to that extent, what you're finding is sort of that convergence of that world in the hybrid context is kind of where we see the big challenge. You're going to have the traditional stuff. You're also moving to the microservice stuff, but you need to be thinking about managing all of this in the context of each other versus thinking of these things as completely separate from each other. And so you'll begin to hear the word microservices. I'm sure dev folks have already heard this because that's a lot of the big trends out there. But that's going to be the big game changer as I begin to think about the manageability aspects of your application per se, because it's extremely difficult to manage in a very dynamic environment. And the difficult part of this is where APM has moved to, is ensuring that we can manage those dynamic environments, because the problems are going to be, your environment is going to be different minute to minute, second to second. And so you got to be able to not only know, you've got to basically time slice your environment to really get a sense of what was the exact problem in a particular time period. And so that's where APM is in the context of managing those very dynamic environments per se. And we believe the same concept that you can use effectively in the dev test environment as such. If you begin to think very quickly, and I'll go very quickly through the next couple of slides. So what is ultimately, at the end of the day, what's the point of slide 13? What we really want to do is to think about it as you want to be thinking about managing your application from day one. Before you write that first line of code in design and architecture, you got to build that manageability aspect in, because you cannot afford to have delays in terms of introducing management in later in the cycle. It makes it a very non-agile cycle, puts you in the slow IT model. We really want to be in the fast IT model. So really you think about management right at design and architecture. That's when you start thinking about it. You introduce it, you put in the capabilities all the way through and use it all the way from dev to functional test to performance test to application support when you have problems, and ultimately in giving you feedback of how your application is being used so you can do something about it. So that's essentially what you begin to see, sort of application lifecycle and APM tools are being used there. If you take a look at slide 14, next slide, this is really kind of what DevOps is forcing ultimately us to do. It's forcing us to drive continuous insights. Because your time slices are short, you can't do these things manually. You can't do these things by looking at a screen 24/7. So really what you want to be able to do, you want to have what I would call a continuous insight engine. And those are what you call your dashboards and analytics around that. But there are three fundamental pillars to that continuous insights engine. One is around ensuring continuous delivery. You want to get that code out there every minute, every hour, every day. You can't afford to have delays in it, so that's kind of the big category of things that you'll see with continuous delivery. It's really about ensuring speed, but having that control. The aspect of continuous availability. It is okay in the past if your test environment is down, dev environment, no big deal, go to resolve it when you needed to use it. You don't have that luxury anymore. You're always testing, you're always developing, so you've got to ensure that that environment's always available and that environment's always representative of your production class workload. So effectively, you're going to see continuous availability, and this is kind of where APM fits in. We want to ensure it's always on with operations built into your application set. Then the third aspect is continuous security, is making sure you're not breaking the security of the app as you keep evolving it. And really that kind of introduces it to the idea of what we call the open tool chain. The idea is what we call a DevOps tool chain. You'll see a little bit as I talk about in the next slide. The idea is that DevOps users use what we call the DevOps tool chain. And if you go to slide 15, this is kind of a representation of what this is. Because what you're going to find is really, we've always been doing operations. There are applications that went out for being used. There was always operations, and operations did all sorts of things around logging, monitoring, event management, notification, runbooks, root cause. It did all of that stuff. What we want to do is ultimately have the tool chain plug in, and the tool chain is really bringing in the DevOps user to go leverage the data that operations already been gathering, rather than go back and recreate that whole gathering yourself. And really, it's trying to create that bridge between dev and ops, so you're talking the same language and not completely different languages, because that is where you introduce delays, and that's where you introduce slow AT back into your environment. So that's kind of the concept, at least, of where we see how DevOps is going to use APM/operations management capabilities all the way through the full tool chain, starting from the learn aspect all the way down to the manage aspect of the application per se.
So Arun, a question for you. When we look at these new complex environments with the microservices, with containers, reuse of containers to expand a small development system into testing, staging, and then ultimately production, and we also think back to one of the early slides about all the powerful capabilities that APM brings in, a very common question I get from my customers is, when can I introduce APM into my DevOps lifecycle, and where should I start with it?
It's a great question, Dan, because as I've talked to clients, with the first question that they ask me, that's great, we talk about APM, so where do I start? Let's take that question first. Typically, the biggest value proposition a lot of our customers see early in the DevOps lifecycle, especially, is really testing, is where they introduce things like synthetic monitoring. The idea that you just want to know if your application is going to work okay from across the globe for different browsers, different mobile devices, and if your APIs are doing well. It's a very quick way of knowing if your application is going to be at least available. Sometimes a lot of the stuff, customers would say they get stuff out there without really knowing if they've actually tested for any of those considerations. So for me, I think about it as start with that. And we can kind of go back a little bit into some of the capabilities, because slide 16 through on, I'm going to talk a little bit about where do you want to start? What do you want to think about? How do you want to think about bringing application management to the context of where you are in your DevOps lifecycle? So let's spend a few minutes on slide 16, which is the next slide, around key capabilities. The first area that people could really use this stuff is with logging, because we today gather up logs. We write logs. Developers, the first thing, as a developer when I started, not so long back, the big thing was we would actually go in and write messages to the logs. We then go look for those instances of those messages in the logs to know if particular parts of the code were being exercised, so you wanted to troubleshoot the application as you were moving along. That is a very manual exercise, and you have lots of logs in lots of different places, lots of different components that generate logs, and the idea that now you have to go look at 20 files to go back and figure out where the problem is makes no sense. And one of the things that we had done effectively in the context of production applications was production operations had to do log management to go back and root cause problems, because they are very complex environments. So what they did was they really looked at the idea of building patterns to look for in the logs that ultimately gave them an insight as to what the diagnostic was, ultimately to give them a way to fix the problem. So what we find with logs, for example, is you can actually, with your pattern matching, you can effectively, and some cognitive capabilities as well, which you'll see extensively with log management, you're going to see the ability to kind of identify, hey, I looked at all these logs in your application environment. We think there's a problem because this pattern is being represented. This is stuff that you don't have to do manually anymore. You can just do this. This is an automated system that gives you that kind of insight, and then you can take it from there to root causing it. The other thing that you want to do with logs is, or any kind of what I would call logging management thing, is ultimately to look at documentation to figure out what might be the appropriate fix for that as well. And this is where the whole area of cognitive comes in, because you can actually apply cognitive technologies to ultimately figure out what is the most ideal scenario, looking at all the documentation, is to go fix this kind of problem. If this is a memory leak and I found a memory leak in this component, what is the best way to go fix it? And so you make that correlation. And all at the end of the day, what this does is it really enables you to address that service availability aspect, and it also makes the dev test environment much more efficient. The dev test production environment all the more efficient, because now what you have is the ability to kind of look at these things very, very quickly versus having to do it very manually per se. And the other thing I'll introduce later is there's ways and different ways of looking at it as well. We'll come to that in a couple of slides. So very quickly on 17, next slide. So what we've always done in APM is we do monitoring. We tell you how your environment is doing. We give you some key KPIs. Your memory is so much. Your pool utilization is so much. So there are 10, 20, 50, 100, 500 metrics depending on how much you want to get in terms of these metrics being available. So you want to be able to monitor the application. So you really want to look at it in the context of the end user. I said, going back to end your question, where do you start? That's the place you start. You start looking at how is my end user experiencing the app. So that's a good place to start. And then go back and drill down from there onwards to if there was a problem, then we can drill down into where the problem is, and then we can do all the things like log management to get to the root cause of the problem in addition to all the other things. So really you want to make your end users happy by ensuring that they're doing well. You want to actually ensure that 5.9 availability. You want to know if you're up and running all the time, which is where synthetics comes into the picture, because synthetics is even if there's a user, if most of your users are going to be between 9 and 5, you want to be ensuring that that application is running all the way through the night, even if there are no users on it. So when it's 8:55 in the morning, if you have a problem and people come in at 9 and the app is down and you have to go troubleshoot for 2 hours, you don't want that. You want the ability to know if it's running 24/7. And that's part of the availability spectrum, is to ensure that that app is available all the time, to give you a sense of how to make sure you're servicing your customer base effectively. And really, it's a way of also accelerating that app deployment, because you look at basic metrics, look at customer experience management / you look at things like synthetic monitoring. What you do is you understand if between releases, if your app is actually performing badly, so you can actually roll back. The number of things that you can do here just in terms of looking at the characteristics before the release and after release, so you know what to do about it once the release goes out the door. It becomes a critical part of your DevOps lifecycle. As apps go out, you ensure that those apps are performing to particular benchmarks. Otherwise, you roll back to where you need to be. And that's kind of where basic monitoring capabilities come in. It just tells you, hey, before you were working much better than right now, so you may want to roll back to go back and figure out what the problem is. Or maybe you want to figure out what the problem is right away and fix it in the current environment as well. But either one works. But the idea really is that it gives you a way of validating your app's life cycle as it's moving through the different phases from dev, test to prod, and vice versa. It's also about ensuring that your apps, as they go from release 1 to release 2 to release 3, you want to be able to kind of benchmark it as you move along, so you can ensure that these apps are rolled out properly. So that's kind of what monitoring does. Key capability APM is around monitoring, and that's what it does. It provides those kind of insights. Dan, are there any other examples that you wanted to bring up, or?
Oh, absolutely. When I talk with when I'm sort of straddling the fence between development and architecture teams and operations, there's always the questions about how well did I perform in a development environment, and how can I use that monitoring data, those KPIs, to help me properly size my higher environments. In some cases in the past, it's a very quick guess. In other cases, where there's a good process in place, using tools like APM, we're able to get the operations teams and then ultimately the production support teams the sort of solid data that they need for proper server sizing, queue sizes, JVM, JVM garbage collection properties, database connection pools, message queuing, and the like, as well as the number of instances, for example, of services involved in an environment. So monitoring gives us some very solid information from that area as well.
Fantastic. So guys, so what I wanted to do, next slide, slide 18, really is just spend a little bit of time on talking about notification. So very often the problem that when we talk to clients was, when we talk to the production side of the house, they said, I don't want to see consoles 24/7. Tell me when there is a problem. Tell me if you think there is, if there is going to be a problem, and then I want to be involved. But don't expect me to be sitting and staring at the screen 24/7, because production environments are highly complex environments. And you're going to get events and notifications from tons of different places. And so they've production folks have mastered the ability to kind of manage their environment, what I would call event-driven. They're kind of interrupt-driven. Versus in the dev test environments has been traditionally less of that. And what I've found is I've talked to a lot of dev test folks that are beginning to start going down this journey, is they say, look, we get too many, in our tools we get too many alerts. I got hundreds of these. I get my email boxes are full. Can't deal with it. What I need is the ability to cut that down so I can actually go focus on the 4 or 5 or 6 problems that need to happen, need to be dealt with, as opposed to going out and dealing with hundreds and hundreds of email messages for me to go email or Slack or whatever else that you're getting alerts or notifications from. They want to be able to manage the volume of it. So this is where I think APM has come into the idea of ultimately providing what I would call intelligent alerts. These are analytics-driven alerts, and so these notifications are much more rich in their ability to deliver, insights that you can actually do something about. So it's really the key here is when you have 500 alerts and there's a critical alert in the middle, you may miss it. In this case, when you reduce the amount of alerts that you're getting back or in terms of notifications, you're able to go deal with it. So it's really about the idea of thinking in the dev environment ultimately about looking for those critical alerts only. It's about routing those alerts so you get the right people. Not everybody knows that part of the code, so you want to get it to the right person. You want to ultimately manage escalations on it. You want to reduce any kind of alert noise on it, and you want to get it in also the different ways. Some people like it on a Slack channel. Some people like it somewhere else. Some people like it on an email. Some people like it on their phone. So there's so many different ways you want to do this, but you want to be thinking about managing your environment all the way through your dev lifecycle in kind of that intelligent notification-based model, as opposed to what I would call the traditional model of having to go back and look at email alerts about problems that are occurring, because that can just inundate you with issues at some point. You're just going to ignore it. So that's a key element. It's a mindset shift between production and dev, because production's always alert-driven only. They don't look at consoles. Dev is very console-driven because they feel like, but as your environment mimics production environments, the number of alerts you're going to get is going to be significantly larger, and it just becomes impossible to deal with. Okay. And the last slide, guys, before we'll just finish with the wrap-up slide, but really key here is it's really about driving in production. We've done this for years. Is driving automation in. So if problem may occur, solve it with this automation capability. The key here is you need to think about, even in dev tests, it's the same thing. And in fact, in the cloud generation, automation is going to be part and parcel of what you do. As you make that evolution in the cloud, it's really about driving automation to get agility. So you want to be automating everything that you do. For example, we're doing this with Agile. We're all automating testing completely. We have to automate deployment. We have to automate fixing. So this is what you're beginning to see, sort of the idea is that you need to think automation day one. And you got to think about it in the context of what we call runbooks. And these are, specific resolutions to problems based on certain kinds of events. So the idea is you want to create and execute these runbooks. You really want to do it, part and parcel of knowing when these are applied, what was the right fix. You want to do some level of social media kind of models of saying this runbook is better than that runbook, so you can give it a star rating. So what you begin to think about, at least in production, we do this a lot. The idea is the same thing applies in dev test now, is the idea that now you can create runbooks, you can evaluate runbooks, and you can effectively automate the full environment that you're working on. So this is kind of a gist of the main areas that we see in APM that need to be thought about well early in the cycle. I am definitely, I would want to open it up for any questions per se, but slide 20 is very simply, this is for folks, if you're interested, you can go to our website and take a look at it. But the point is, this is sort of the thinking that we have, as we experience it with clients, is this is the thinking that we need to go drive, is the ability to take us from that slow IT generation to fast IT, and we think DevOps is the way to do it. And DevOps and cloud are really the true enablers. I think the third leg of that stool is going to be cognitive. We are up on the cognitive front as well with some of the stuff we're doing in Watson. But the point is, that's going to redefine how ops and dev work together. It's also going to redefine at a fundamental way the expectations and the value proposition that clients have about working with different kind of tool sets. With that, I'm going to wrap up, guys. I may have run a little long, but at least open it up for some questions. And if there's any questions I can't get to, we can always handle it further after as well.
So, Arun, we had a question. Thanks, Alan. We had a question from one of our attendees asking how we can better architect our monitoring solutions for our customers. Typically, the operations team has some sort of an APM solution in place in production environments. Are there any sort of high-level best practices that we can discuss about how and when we can get APM into the earlier environments and further left in the development cycle?
Yep, very good question. So one of the things that you'll find is this is actually a use case that's come up, and we have done this in the past. We do production operations. We work with a lot of production folks, and they gather up the data. In fact, in one of the slides, I believe slide 15, we showed it. The idea is that what the operations team wanted to do is to provide a snapshot view for their dev teams and DevOps teams. So they get a view of how their application is doing in an actual production. They call it a line of business view. And it gives them metrics that they care about as opposed to what production cares about. Production cares about slightly different things. And so what we've been able to do, at least address that in the context to give them a view of the data that production operations gets, but the DevOps teams are able to consume that, and that becomes sort of one use case of being able to do that. The next use case is really production teams provide agents that can be incorporated into the build. There's no reason why it needs to be incorporated later in the cycle. It can be incorporated into the build, and those agents provide insights right all the way from the dev, and in a lot of cases it's agents, so sometimes it's agentless as well. But a lot of times what you do is essentially you put it in, and then you're able to get that information from day one. You don't have to wait till it goes to production. You get it day one, as long as you incorporate it into the build cycle as you take it through a life cycle.
Right, and Arun, that's a very important aspect to keep in mind, because once that agent's in place, even though, as we saw in one of the earlier slides, there are a lot of different functions that are available from that set of agents, you only have to enable the ones that you need in each environment. So starting off in dev, you might look just at a log monitoring component. Then as you move up into, say, a testing environment or a UAT environment, you may then start gathering some of your KPIs, your resource metrics, memory, CPU, etc. Then you'll enable some of the transaction tracking and the correlation to give you a broader view. With that agent that gets installed right from your change management system, as soon as you deploy that environment right through your orchestration layer, you then have all the code necessary. You just have to flip the switches to enable the desired components. Now, when you move into a production environment, there's always the consideration around security. In most cases, the security changes that are required to move an agent from basically an all open development mode to a locked down production mode have to do with user accounts and permissions on files and directories. Those are typically addressed in many of my customers with some simple scripting, which then can take that agent that's already in place, already configured, point it to a different set of management servers for the reporting purposes, and then change the permissions into that locked down production mode.
Excellent. Guys, we do have a few other questions here I'd like to try to get to.
Sure.
If just bear with me. Someone had asked for a little clarity around APM in the general context, let's say, of APM compared to APM in actual product, or IBM product, or what have you. I don't know, Arun, if you want to address that.
Yeah, so let me say, APM, I consider APM as a discipline. It's not really a product name. We may have products that are called that. That's because we deliver that capability. In fact, if you look outside and you look for APM, and in fact, I think Forrester, Gartner, everybody references it. It is a set of capabilities, a number of capabilities I just talked about that are considered part and parcel of APM. Synthetic monitoring, if you think about basic transaction tracking, diagnostics, These are all sub-capabilities inside the APM capability. But as such, APM is a capability. It's an industry standard capability that is typically used by customers to go manage their apps. Traditionally, it's been managing these in production environments and ensuring they don't ever go down. But it's also about now shifting left and managing it all the way from the development lifecycle, from the beginning of the development lifecycle.
Got it. And by the way, that really wasn't a question Michael had submitted. He was just making an observation, if you will.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. Next question, though. And how does the adoption of a microservice-based architecture benefit APM, or is it benefited by APM?
It has benefited. Let me explain why it's benefited by APM, because one of the things that APM has had to address is sort of a very dynamic environment. It is actually extremely important to manage in a very dynamic environment, because you're not going to be physically able to do much of this stuff manually per se, because things are changing by the second, by the minute, and your ability to keep track of all of this, you need basic machine capabilities to do so. So we look at APM as helping you manage in that environment as such, and frankly, in our case, in the IBM case, not only is we think it's important to manage those environments, it is also important to have your APM tools leveraging that technology and capabilities as such, because that gives us fundamentally an advantage in managing dynamic environments. So not only do we need to go manage microservice environments, we need to be microservice-based ourselves to give us the advantages of dynamic scale to manage in a dynamic environment.
Got it. Well, gentlemen, we can talk more about this, but unfortunately we are at the top of the hour and out of time. Dan, Arun, thanks for joining us today, and you know what? It's not easy doing this without the slides in front of you like this. So Arun, extra credit points to you. Thank you so much.
I'll take it.
Okay. Guys, as I said, we're at the top of the hour. Thanks very much for an interesting webinar on APM, shifting left, DevOps. Thanks to our audience for joining us today. Always a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next DevOps.com webinar. But for now, this is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.